In the previous video, I had shown you how you could use the dunder name technique to separate the importable code in your program from the executable code. One other technique that you'll frequently see used in Python programs is where you create a main function. So here you can see once again I have my DNSIP function. I have a function main, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'll have a dividing line, the dunder name dividing line between my importable program and the executable code that's specific to this program. Now notice the only thing that I have inside the executable code that is specific to this program is just a function call. And the function call that I'm using is just main. And there's no special, it doesn't have any special significance. This is entirely convention. But basically I'm saying here, when it gets down to here, so if we run this code from top to bottom, what it'll do is it'll define this function, it'll define this second function main, it'll get here, it'll see that this function is true, or this if conditional is true. It'll then call the main function, and then it'll start executing the code that is inside this main function. So now, once again, if we imported this function, like if we imported main_func inside IPython, what would happen is it would once again start at the top, start going through it line by line. It would define this function, it would get here. This would be false. So it would never execute the main function. Now, what are, you can rationally ask, well, what are the advantages of doing this versus just moving this code down here? And I think these are fairly minor, but I do think it makes your program structurally easier to read and understand. It also helps you avoid variable name conflicts, because the only variables you're going to have that would not be inside a function, because any variables you had inside the main function would be encapsulated inside that main function. So then you really should only have constants that would be outside, that you'd probably define at the very top of your program. So you really wouldn't have any variables that were outside a function. So you greatly reduce the likelihood of accidentally running into a variable name conflict that causes negative side effects. Now, one other thing you can do with this is if you import this, so if you say, and just to show you that what I'm saying is correct, so we go ahead and do Python and execute this, you can see it does jump into main, it does call DNSIP, it does the first printout, which is just using the default value of 8.8.8. It then invokes it a second time using the 1.1.1 value. We print both of those out. If I go into IPython and I say import this, you'll see it doesn't print anything out. But now if we do a dir on it, you can see I have both my DNSIP function available to me, and I also have my main function available to me. So I could say this if I wanted to manually invoke that function, and I could pass in a different DNS server, but then I could also, if I wanted to invoke my main function, I could do that as well. So its purpose is just fundamentally to simplify the structure of your program and try to make it a bit clearer how your program is structured and where your execution of your program begins. It can get a little bit challenging, say, if your program execution is here and everything is underneath this and it has no structure in it and there's, a large number of lines, it could potentially get confusing, where this makes it fairly clear where the total execution starts off at. Okay, so last point I want to bring up is just general structure of your program. So general structure for how you should structure your overall program. So you'd have imports at the top. I'm going to actually jump down to the if name place. So Here we have our dividing line between executable code that's specific to this program and importable code. Now, it's possible that you don't have any executable code that is specific to this program, that all you have is really things that you're going to import in different programs. So that's entirely possible, in which case you wouldn't need this if name equals main, and then you would just have your functions, classes, constants above there. So now I sometimes do the main technique, sometimes I don't. Generally, I sort of use it if I have a lot of code, if I want to keep it cleaner and simpler where my main executable code is located that's particular to this function. So that I'm a little bit more like, yeah, it's okay. It can be a little bit nicer structurally, but it's not super important to me. If I do have both executable code and importable code in the same program, I will almost always make this dividing line, this if conditional dividing line, especially if it's anything that I think there's a reasonable chance I want to reuse the functions that I'm creating in there. And then across time, there's a good chance I would actually probably relocate functions into a dedicated library module, into a dedicated module whose purpose was just to be reused and that didn't have any specific executable code associated with it. Okay, so structurally, your program's generally going to look like you have imports at the top of the file. So here, just for, we're not actually using in this code, but I import some library. This no QA is just so the linter won't complain because I'm not actually using that code anywhere else in here. Then I have some constants. So notice naming convention for constants is all uppercase. You would use underscore for the word separator. Once again, this is entirely a convention. Python will not enforce this in any way, so I could very easily reassign DNS1 to be a different, name server as part of my program. So even though I'm naming it as a constant, there's nothing in Python that's going to enforce that variable can't change. Now, below that, I would have functions and classes. So here I'm showing you, the simple function we've been using for this module, for these modules examples. And then here I have my main function. I would generally have my main function as my last function right before my if name divider section. So I think that structure is fairly good and fairly understandable and fairly consistent with Python convention.